This is the Project Management Podcast. We bring project management topics to beginners and experts. Find us on the web at www.thepmpodcast.com or send your emails to pmpodcast@gmail.com.
Hello and welcome to episode number 132. I am Cornelius Fichtner. This is the Project Management Podcast for the 21st of November 2009. Nice to have you with us. A project is defined in the PMBOK guide as a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. At the core of this definition lies the fact that there is something that our customer wants and that it is our job to deliver this something. We call this something the scope of the project, and the absolute best way to define, document, and detail your scope is by using a work breakdown structure, a WBS. But honestly now, when was the last time that you really used a WBS on your project? And if you used one, did you use it correctly? Josh Nankivel is a PMP who has about a decade of project management experience. During this time, he used the WBS on initiatives that range from small projects to large-scale aerospace programs. The WBS was always one of the cornerstones of his work. Sometimes it was even a contractual requirement. A few weeks ago, Josh released the WBS Coach. This is a downloadable training seminar that you can go through on your own time. Josh put all of his experience and practical advice into this training, and you can take a closer look at it by going to mywbscoach.com. In our interview today, Josh and I will be looking at the basics of the WBS and how you can best use it on your projects to make them a success. Here, however, are first two quick notes before we get to this interview. The first note is the reminder that you've heard from me a number of times in the last few episodes. Please tell just one of your colleagues today that you are a listener and maybe even a fan of the Project Management Podcast and how they would benefit from it as well. For instance, they can earn up to 15 free PDUs just by listening. Thank you. And second, in about 2 weeks from now, I will be releasing a product review video episode of the podcast in which I will introduce you in detail to Josh's WBS Coach. I'll show you exactly what you are going to get with his training. That way you know what's in the package before you're going to have to open it. And in the spirit of full disclosure, if you decide to purchase his training at mywbscoach.com, then the Project Management Podcast will receive a commission from your purchase. This commission helps us cover the expenses for all our activities here. Thank you. And now, on to our interview. Josh Nankivel, PMP, is the founder of pmstudent.com, a site dedicated to helping new and aspiring project managers succeed. Josh has been managing IT and non-IT projects in computing, financial services, telecommunications, and aerospace for over a decade. Josh also writes about topics for new project managers on many websites and blogs. He has a Bachelor's of Science degree in project management and is PMP certified. Enjoy the interview.
The Project Management Podcasts feature interview.
Hello, Josh, and welcome to the Project Management Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we want to talk about how to use a WBS if you want a better project. So let's begin with some basics here and start at the very beginning. Can you tell us what a WBS is? Maybe a bit of an overview here and maybe even some historic background as well. For instance, do you know who invented the WBS?
Sure. So in the late 50s, early 60s, the DoD, Department of Defense in the U.S., and then NASA getting into the early 60s. So they were the two major agencies that were involved in the development of it. So in the beginning, it was mostly a military and aerospace type of process. I believe it had kind of came out of some initial PERT documentation that was done back then.
Mm-hmm.
So since then, it's evolved in those industries, and then it's expanded into more general project management. I think the PMI was the one that kind of generalized the concept and made it a part of broader project management starting in the late 80s, maybe 87, 88, around that time frame.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially a WBS is a special kind of deliverables-based outline. It contains a graphic, usually, and a dictionary as well that goes into detail of the different elements, and it's really the representation of your project scope. So meaning the results that you will deliver. So if it's a deliverable based project, it's a product that you're delivering. Those deliverables will be what's on your WBS. It's a communication tool. It's something that you can use as a kind of like a common language on your project across all the different artifacts. And when you're talking about things, whether it's in a status report or anywhere else on your project, you can make reference to the WBS as a kind of a common language. It's not a task list. So I think one of the things that happens with the WBS is it gets used as a task list a lot. So it's not a task list. It's not an org chart. Those are two completely different things. This is specifically project-based, and it's not time-phased. And this one might be controversial. Some people do believe that the WBS can be used in a time-phased manner. I address it specifically in my WBS coach training as to why I don't use it as a time-phased document at all.
Mm-hmm. What will the WBS help me achieve on the project?
Well, a few things. It's a definition. So it's the definition of the outcomes, the deliverables, the results that your project is supposed to produce. So that's probably the primary thing that it does. It helps with clarity. Like I said before, common language. It kind of helps you clearly define what those deliverables are, what done looks like. So when something is done, when you deliver something, what is it? If it's an order entry interface, that's what you're delivering. So you're not going to deliver half of an order entry interface. It's going to be the full thing. And in the WBS, you can flesh out some of what that means. It's really the foundation of project documentation and planning. It's the basis for doing task identification and things like that. You don't actually do task identification in the WBS, but it's a starting point for going through and doing the task identification. It allows you to put together some accountability. So once you have your WBS in place, you can do an OBS, an organizational breakdown structure, and a RAM, a responsibility assignment matrix to assign responsibility to the different WBS elements. It helps with manageability to break down your deliverables into manageable chunks so that you're not trying to estimate something that's huge. And it also helps achieve change control on your projects. So when changes happen on projects, and they do, everybody who's run a project knows that the only thing that's consistent is change. And so by using a WBS, you have a kind of like a central hub where you've got traceability from that to all of your other artifacts, so that if a change does happen, you can go to that and trace to your other artifacts, so you know what effects that change is going to have across your project.
If I hear this right, then the WBS seems to be a really central tool, because you've touched what? You've touched almost any other area in the project now, saying the WBS is a basis for this, for that, for the other.
Yeah, when I first began managing projects, I didn't use the WBS. I didn't know what it was. But now that I've used it quite a bit, I've used it on small projects, on really large projects. I can't imagine trying to manage a project now without using a WBS. It's a completely foreign concept to me.
Right. Paint me a picture here. You mentioned earlier on the order entry system that we're going to deliver. Let's stick with that for a moment. So if I have a WBS, what will I see in regards to the order entry system? Will there just be one line that says, build an order entry system? That's it?
Probably not, and it depends. And actually, the way that you phrased that, I would say that it's incorrect. If in the WBS, you're not listing tasks in there, so you wouldn't say, I'm going to build an order entry system.
You just say order entry system.
Order entry system. Now,
Right.
the order entry system probably has quite a few different sub-deliverables or things that make it up. So the order entry system could consist of, you've got a user interface for your order entry system. Maybe you've got a database or a back-end component. All those different components that make up your order entry system would be sub-deliverables underneath the order entry system. So your order entry system might be at level 2 in your WBS, and you'd break that down into the smaller, more manageable deliverables at level 3.
Right. And of course, the idea being that building an order entry system is too big a task. You have to break it down and break it down and break it down to a level where you could say, okay, this is small enough so that I can give this piece to Joe, that piece to Susan, and this one here is a sub-project that we're handing off to another team and they'll take care of that. Correct?
Right. Yep.
Yeah. So let's come back to the error that I have just made a little moment ago. Because if I see this right, even though it's called a work breakdown structure, the WS is in fact deliverables oriented. There are no tasks in there. There's no work in there at all. Why is that?
Well, one of my favorite quotes is from Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And I think it was habit number 2 that was begin with the end in mind. And that's exactly what a WBS helps you do. The reason why you're focusing on outcomes is because you want to first focus on defining the results to be achieved. So you do this via requirements and via a deliverable-based WBS. If you try to start with the how, the when, the who, and the without having the what clearly defined. So if you just open up Microsoft Project and start plugging tasks in there, if you start doing that before you have the what clearly defined, what you're going to deliver, then you're going to start making unnecessary assumptions and leaving the definition of your product open to individual interpretations. And that's going to cause conflict on your project, because if you just start assigning tasks, well, it may mean something different to Joe than it does to Emily. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you start with the deliverable and you really get a good definition of what the result looks like, what is the goal of this, then you can kind of start from there and work down into the tasks.
Okay. So we've defined sort of what the WS is, what it helps me do, and why there is actually no work in it. Is there anything that a WBS will not help me achieve? Is there anything that I cannot use it for?
Like I've said before, you shouldn't be defining tasks in your
Right.
WBS. So that's one thing. Task definition is not something. It will help you because you start with the WBS and then you can go into the task definition. You've got something much more clear to start building a task list, from, but you're not going to do that in the WBS. So another thing is estimates. Now, some of these, this is the way that I do it. This is the way that I've found in experience that I've had from the PC, telecommunications, financial services, and in the aerospace industry, that you don't want to be doing your estimates in the WBS. So what I do, and I'm going to use an example from the last project that I was on, which was an aerospace project. You start with the WBS, you get your deliverables and your results defined, and then from there, I take that into something that's called the basis of estimates, which is where I break down the lowest level of the WBS even further into the tasks that make it up, and I start doing estimation, doing 3-point estimates, things like that at that level. So the basis of estimates is where I do the estimation activity. I don't do it in the WBS itself.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, you'll go and you'll aggregate it all the way to the top in the end, so that you have, you've got the lowest level estimated, and then you aggregate it up, right?
That's right. You don't. Yeah. So with all these things, you don't do your activity definition and estimation in the WBS, but you can always roll the results of those things back up so that you can assign a cost to a specific deliverable in your WBS, for instance. So another thing that the WBS is not for is time phasing deliverables or showing dependencies in terms of, start to finish to start dependencies, those types of things. These are task-based items, and they're in the realm of scheduling. You don't want to be doing that already in your WBS. The WBS is just focused on scope. It's not focused on schedule. And then, again, the WBS specifies the what. It's not concerned with how, when, why, or who.
All right, let's get some listener questions in, because before we did our interview, I went over to Twitter and I put out that we have an interview with you coming up about the WBS, and I have two questions for you that come directly from Twitter. The first one here is from a gentleman called Todd Biela. T. Biela is his Twitter handle, and let's see, he is a project manager living in Monaca, Pennsylvania, working out of my home, living with my wife and two kids who are 2 and 4.5 years old. He says, how does one go about explaining the WBS value to an organization that doesn't want to embrace the theory?
This is a really good question, because there are a lot of organizations out there that don't see the WBS as an essential project management tool. Like I said, when I first started managing projects, I didn't use the WBS. I didn't even know what it was. So I was in organizations that didn't value it. But with any change, if you're going to propose something new, then people have to see the what's in it for me. You have to sell them on the benefits. Mm-hmm. And we've already talked about a lot of the benefits that come from using a WBS. But a really good way to do this is to implement it on, one project, like a pilot project or something like that. If you implement it correctly, then you can showcase the benefits that you see from it. So, and in my experience, when I managed projects without a WBS versus when I managed them with a WBS, and then later on in my career when I started really getting serious about making sure that I'm doing the WBS correctly, it's just a night and day difference in terms of, all those things we already talked about, the communication, the clarity of, what we're doing, what we're working on, the ability to produce good estimates, all those things just get so much better when you've got a WBS on your project. So, and really, if you do that, if you have a pilot project and it could be a formal pilot project, or it could be, if, hopefully as a project manager, you've got enough room so that you can go ahead and implement this as a tool on your project without, getting approval or anything like that. I mean, it's really just a method of managing the project. But if you implement this in an organization that isn't using it at all, and you start using it and using it well, it's gonna, the difference in your capability as a project manager is gonna be easy to see.
Oh yeah, I can speak to that as well. I had a situation in also one of my last jobs that I was working at. They were looking for a small system that they wanted in one of their departments, and I spoke to the customer there, and we talked for about a week or so on and off. And in the background, I started creating a WBS of all the items that we are going to need to create in order for this small system to be produced. And in the end, I printed out a WBS that was, I think, about 4 or 5 pages wide. And I then taped those 4 or 5 pages together, and I showed up at our next meeting and I put it up on the wall. I said, well, this is everything that you want in the end. And it was incredible. The eyes of the customer, suddenly, oh my God, this is our small system. So it was very good for me, to be able to present this tool to him, this WBS, to the customer, and say, this is it. This is what you're going to want to build. And it really opened their eyes, and it opened them wide. So yeah, I agree with what you said, Josh. And the question to Todd, the question here that Todd asked, what do you do if they don't want the theory? Give it to them in practice. Just go ahead and use it. You don't really need approval from anyone to use a WBS. Just use it, and use it well.
Yes.
Moving on, a question number 2 that we have comes from, again, Twitter, Eric Bursley. Let's see his bio: computer geek and project manager. Doesn't say much, but at least we know he's a project manager. And the question that he asks is, how can you leverage the WBS with agile project management?
Yes, this is a good question.
Yeah, absolutely, because the WBS, I think most people see as a very static product that you create at the beginning of a project, whereas agile project management is more iterative, and you keep doing it and keep working on it, and you have various loops that you go through. So how do we work this?
Yes, and I've run into a lot of Agilists who, definitely see the value of the WBS and, use that on their projects, definitely. I've also run into some that are very anti-WBS. They're like, no, this is Agile. We don't need a WBS. We've got our own processes and things. So I think for the most part that Agilists butt heads with the WBS concept at times because in my experience, it's not implemented well in most cases. People just don't do the WBS correctly, or at least as what my experience shows me to be the correct way to do it. So if you're listing tasks on your WBS, you're doing it wrong, and it's going to directly conflict with Agile practices if you're doing that. In Agile, I'm most familiar with Scrum. The sprint backlog has tasks like, code the user interface, and as we know, tasks don't belong on the WBS. So if you've got them on your WBS, you're going to have, some kind of weird thing where you've got, two different artifacts that are trying to do the same thing. The other thing is if you're listing tasks on your WBS, you are dictating to the Agile team, how they should be doing their job. And really, you shouldn't be doing that. You should just be saying, this is what we need to do. We need the user interface, but not, you don't want to be telling them exactly how to go about doing that. The other question is between a deliverables-based WBS or a use case-based WBS for Agile projects. I've seen Agile projects where they use use cases in lieu of deliverables. I'm not currently an Agile practitioner. I've used Scrum in the past, definitely not an expert on it. But I would still insist, if I were doing an Agile project today, I would still insist on doing a deliverables-based WBS. The product backlog would then have traceability to the WBS because the product backlog is, a list that it's really a checklist. It's something that you can reprioritize as you see fit. The iterative nature and the responsive nature of an Agile project requires you to be able to reprioritize things as you go. You don't want to lose that. The product backlog, you can't get rid of that. That's very important. I mean, it's essential to the Agile process, but it needs to interface with the WBS so that those two things are not stepping on each other's toes. So you can still reprioritize the backlog, make changes there as necessary. I think like I said before, the key distinction is the product backlog and the sprint backlogs. Those are checklists. Those are things that as you go through an iteration, you get this thing done, you check it off, that's done. You do your burn down chart and you're through with it. With a WBS, that's not how a WBS is. It's not a checklist. You don't go through and say, well, this is done and I'm checking it off my WBS. The WBS is really a representation of the scope of your entire project, so it's not something that you go through like a checklist. You can iterate on the user interface over and over and over again as you go through your sprints, but in the end, you've got a user interface, and that's your deliverable, and that's the kind of thing that the WBS keeps track of.
Mm-hmm. I have another one that may seem irreconcilable between the WBS and the type of projects that I've been doing, because very often in my career, I was involved in projects where we didn't actually create any physical deliverables because it was a service-oriented project. What now? What goes into my WBS?
I talk about this in, I think a little bit in Lesson 2 and Lesson 4 in the training. Essentially, on a service-oriented project, and you get this, you still have the same question even if you have a deliverable, but you've got things on your project that are not tangible deliverables, mm-hmm. right? So you've got things like, you're providing project management. You're a part of the project
right.
as the project manager. Configuration management, these things that are services that may be internal deliverables. So it's not something that you're delivering, at the end of the project to a customer, but it's something that's a necessary part of producing whatever you're doing. So I refer to the non-tangible deliverables as activities, as opposed to tasks. So an activity is really just a special kind of deliverable. And again, I cover them in the session, and there's distinct classes of them too. So there's service elements, there's activities, there's analytical elements, there's project management elements, there's engineering elements that are really kind of like support activities and things like that. So, but even with a service-oriented deliverable or something where you don't have a tangible deliverable in the end, you still need to begin with the end in mind. You still need to have an idea of what the result is going to be, and then work, break it down from there, and then work backward into your tasks and things like that. So again, start with the outcome or what the result needs to be, and then later on you can define all the tasks that result in a service being delivered. And that's a good way to look at it, is you are delivering a service.
Okay, that's a fabulous segue into my final question for you, because you said start with the end in mind. And the end, of course, is to deliver a particular scope, but I have never been on a project where the scope didn't change. So, very important question here. How do we deal with scope changes? How do we deal with change requests that are coming in and updating, managing the WBS?
And on my projects, the WBS has been a lifesaver when it comes to
Really? Okay.
to change management and configuration control. And this is the reason why. When a change is proposed, wherever it's coming from, the first thing that I look at is the WBS. And I see which deliverables on this WBS are going to be impacted by the change that's being proposed. If you structured it correctly, then you can do this. And then I've got traceability to all the different artifacts in the project. So on your WBS, once you get it completed, you're going to have a numbering scheme that you use. So, 2.1.3 is the order entry system, for instance. When you get a change that's proposed to the order entry system, again, the first thing that I do is take a look at the WBS, identify the WBS elements that are going to be impacted by this, and then in my requirements, in my basis of estimates, in my schedule, all the different project artifacts that I'm working with, each of those has that WBS identifier.
Right.
It's a common language throughout the project. So I can identify first which WBS pieces are going to be affected by the change, and then I can go to my requirements and highlight those based on that WBS. I can just do a search for that WBS element or elements that are going to be impacted, and I can do the same thing in the schedule, in the basis of estimates, and in that way, I can really clearly, first of all, I can point to the WBS and show whoever's making the suggestion for the change. I can show them, here are the pieces that are going to be changed. These are the deliverables, the results that you're proposing the change for. And I can, kind of get some confirmation from them that yes, that is in fact what they're talking about. And then when I trace through all the other documents, I can figure out exactly what that's going to change. So if I'm going to change the project management baseline, I want to know what the scope changes are. I want to know what the cost changes are. I want to know if there's going to be impact on the schedule,
Right.
Quality, any kind of requirements changes that are going to happen. So by using the WBS, again, is kind of like this central hub where all changes go through the WBS. You can really easily trace all that information out and make it not easy. It's not an easy thing, but you can much more easily, kind of forecast what the impacts are going to be on your project, work up a full, when we went through a change to the project management baseline, you had to produce these things. You had to say specifically which WBS elements are going to be impacted in terms of scope, what's that going to cost, what are the schedule impacts going to be, all these things. And so when you bring that in front of your change control board and say, here's the changes, is it worth it? They can kind of, do a cost benefit analysis and see if that's really something that we want to go through with or not. So it really helps you to have something very concrete so that you can, make the changes that should be made on your project and resist the changes that should not be made. If you have a stakeholder or a sponsor who is kind of willy-nilly making suggestions for changes, by using this process and using your WBS as kind of that central place, you're going to stop any of that. I mean, changes are going to get made if they should be made.
Based on the answer that you have just given, I think I would have to change the question that I originally asked, because I asked, how do we deal with a change request and the WBS? But the question should really be, how can you implement a change request correctly on your project if you don't have a WBS? Because It's such a central tool. It's at the core of everything. And if you don't have a WBS, you will never know what influence a change request is in fact going to have on your project.
Definitely. And one thing to keep in mind is that, and this kind of goes back to the question with the using it in agile project management, the WBS, I think the impression that a lot of people have is that it's this static document that you do your planning up front and you write it in stone and then you never look at it again. That's not, if you're using it that way, you're probably not using it correctly. What it should be is like I said, every change request that comes through should go through the WBS. You can start out with, in fact, you will probably start out in the beginning of your project not having things defined all that well in some areas. So on some things, you're going to know very clearly what the deliverable is, for the short-term things that you're doing. But some of it, I've got an example in my training course where you're doing kind of like a trade study and a tool selection process that you're going through. So you really don't know what the implementation is going to look like until after you've chosen a specific tool that you're going to use, right? So for those later elements that are going to come later when you actually do the implementation, a lot of those in the very beginning of the project are defined at a very high level. Maybe they're broken down to level 2 or 3, and that's it. They're still pretty high level. But then as you get closer to that, once you make your tool selection, then you can go back to your WBS, open up a change request after figuring out how you can define the deliverables at a deeper level so that you can start doing your activity planning and things. So, you can march right along with an Agile project and just different pieces of your WBS. It's not from left to right or anything like that, but different pieces of your WBS are going to get fleshed out in more detail as you go through the different sprints. And it's the same thing in a more deterministic framework when you've got if I'm working on something next month, then I better have a really clear idea of what that deliverable is. If it's something that's 5 years from now and I'm on a really long-term project, well, I'm going to know generally what is going to get produced, but I may not be too clear on the specifics yet.
All right. Josh, thank you so much for stopping by and talking to us about how we can use the WBS to improve our projects. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me.
And that was our interview with Josh Nankivel on how a WBS can help improve your project success. Josh and I already recorded a second interview in which we discussed the proper way of structuring a WBS. That interview will be available next week for our premium listeners. And, as I have said, in about 2 weeks' time, we'll publish a product review video in which I give you my personal review of the WBS Coach, which you can buy at mywbscoach.com. That's it for today. Thank you very much for listening. At this point, let me remind you of that one small favor I asked for you earlier. Please go ahead and tell just one person today that you like and enjoy listening to the Project Management Podcast. Thank you. As always, you can find us on the web at thepmpodcast.com. If you are a project manager who wants to become a PMP, then the easiest way to do so is with our sister podcast, the Project Management Prepcast, and study for the exam by watching over 38 hours of video training from pmprepcast.com. Please send your emails to pmpodcast@gmail.com, and when you write, please tell me where in the world you are writing from. And finally, we have this. What I need is an exact list of specific unknown risks and problems that we might encounter on this project. Until next time.